Hello everyone, my name is Kaitlyn Newley. I am an honours student at UniSQ and thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation. This presentation will explore the research question, what is the nutritional status of Australians living in rural communities compared to Australians living in urban communities, and the Australian recommended dietary guidelines and what influences are present. During this presentation, we will explore the literature surrounding the question, identifying any gaps and limitations in the current literature in order to justify further research in this area. Rural communities face a higher burden of disease, especially chronic conditions that are influenced by diet. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare 2019 Poor Diet Report, heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes are considered to be one of the greatest public health challenges of the 21st century. The National Health and Medical Research Council states that there are a number of other health conditions that are influenced by diet, including obesity, oral, prostate, colorectal, ovarian, and many other types of cancers. The Australian Dietary Guidelines provide up-to-date advice about the amount and types of food that should be eaten to maintain health and well-being. The guidelines are based on scientific evidence and are realistic and practical, meaning that every Australian should be able to meet these guidelines. However, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, most Australians do not meet these guidelines. Within this presentation, the Australian Dietary Guidelines will be used as a benchmark to determine if Australians are meeting dietary recommendations, with the ideal dietary intake matching the dietary guidelines. The first part of this research question is looking at the dietary intake of Australians. Firstly, let's explore the literature available on Australians living in urban communities. During the research for this review, it became clear that there are limited studies available on the dietary intake of Australians living in urban communities. A research article conducted in 2024 by Summerhays, Baker and Vella investigated food diversity and accessibility for sustainable food consumption in Brisbane. This article stated that Brisbane, a low-density city, there is a large separation between residential and retail areas, meaning that households are very rarely located close to shopping centres. This separation means that people need to travel, often further than walking distance, in order to access healthy food choices. Some individuals may not have access to convenient travel and rely on the public transport to move throughout the city, adding further difficulty to accessing healthy food choices. Not only are residential and retail areas separated, but takeout shops such as McDonald's and KFC are conveniently located throughout residential areas, many times making them easier to access. For example, image 4 shows a residential neighbourhood in Sydney. As you can see by the little images, there are 6 chicken-related takeaway food options on this residential street, which is common in low-density cities in Australia. Furthermore, the article did not explicitly state the dietary intake of individuals living in Brisbane, merely commenting on what impacted the food consumption. This was one of the only articles found, and it did not state the dietary intake, which was common amongst most sources found. This highlights the need for further research into the dietary intake of urban communities. Secondly, let's explore the literature available on Australians living rurally. Research conducted by Alston 2020 and Pullen 2021 found that rural Australians are more likely to experience negative influences on diet, including lower education levels, lower income, and higher unemployment rates compared to Australians living urbanly. It is believed that these negative impacts on diet have led to higher incidence of chronic diseases which are impacted by diet, such as type 2 diabetes, obesity, and chronic heart conditions. Due to the small population of rural communities and their distance from urban centres, there is often limited healthy food choices available. This is known as food availability and is one of the major factors that influences dietary intake in rural communities. Not only is there a lack of available healthy food options, but they are also much more costly in rural communities compared to urban ones. A systematic review conducted by Christides in 2021 found that the cost of healthy food options, such as fresh fruit and vegetables, cost up to 50% more in rural communities than it would in urban communities. A number of limitations and gaps were found when exploring literature for this review. While reading previously completed studies, it became clear that while studies collected demographic information about the participants, it was not linked to the results collected during the study. For example, Pullen published a research article titled A Comparison of Diet Quality in a Sample of Rural and Urban Australian Adults. In order to determine this, the demographic information that can be seen in Table 1 was collected. This information includes age, gender, rurality, education, income level, living arrangements, and smoking status. However, as can be seen in Table 2, only gender was linked to the collected results about dietary intake. This is just one example of published research which does not link demographic information to the collected results. Other limitations include the collection of data via non-validated surveys, which makes comparing the results of two studies difficult, and not using public health guidelines, such as the Australian Dietary Guidelines, to benchmark dietary intakes against. These findings were supported by a systematic review conducted by Alston in 2020. The review conducted by Alston 2020 also found that due to the use of non-validated surveys and a lack of benchmarks, that the results of previously conducted research is inconsistent, and that further high-quality research using validated surveys and benchmarks is needed. The second part of this research question was to identify any influences that may be present on dietary intake. Research found that there were three major influences: socioeconomic status, residential area, and ethnic background, specifically focusing on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Gretsch 2017 and Lewis 2021 found that the overall dietary nutritional intake was lower in low socioeconomic groups. However, a review conducted by Lewis and Lee just 1 year earlier in 2020 found that the results of studies looking at dietary intake across socioeconomic groups was inconsistent, and that a definitive result could not be determined. This suggests that further research is needed to ensure that a definitive result can be obtained. As outlined previously in the review, both urban and rural living Australians face challenges when it comes to dietary intake. Australians living in urban communities are influenced by the separation of retail and residential areas, as well as by the convenient placement of takeout options in residential areas, whereas Australians living in rural communities are influenced by a lack of availability of healthy food options due to their distance from urban centres. Within this review, the influence of ethnic background focused on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, as this is what the majority of research focused on. A study conducted by Tonkin 2020 found that most Indigenous Australians met the guidelines for meat and discretionary food intake, while very few met the guidelines for grains, vegetables, dairy, and fruit intake. Indigenous Australians account for 45% of the rural population. The study conducted by Tonkin suggested that without further research, it is highly unlikely that researchers will understand if the challenges facing Indigenous Australians around dietary intake are unique to their population, or if their dietary inadequacies are due to a large percent of the population living rurally. In conclusion, there was very limited research available on the dietary intake of Australians across both urban and rural areas. While conducting the research, it became clear that there is limited data available on dietary intake, as most sources did not report the quantitative dietary intake. Most sources were not comparable due to the use of non-validated surveys and a lack of reference to public health guidelines. Although the Australian dietary guidelines are realistic and practical, most Australians are unable to meet them due to food availability and accessibility issues, as well as the associated cost. Based on the literature review above, it is obvious that further high-quality research is needed into the dietary intake of rural and urban living Australians. Clear guidelines for conducting nutritional research needs to be developed, including validated surveys and benchmarks guided by the public health guidelines to ensure that all future research will provide usable and comparable results. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation.